Okay, question number 5 says, oh wait, before we get to question number 5, we're supposed to have one of your students read James 1:7. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. So what does that have to do with give us this day our daily bread? Um, Everything is given by God. We are so seemingly self-sufficient, especially in America, that we have trouble realizing that sometimes. We work and we get a paycheck. We believe that that paycheck is a result of the work that we have put in. Um, we have food on our table because of that paycheck. We think that that food on our table is a result of us working and getting the paycheck. And it all, we think, comes from our own effort. But actually, everything, including the food that you put in your mouth on a daily basis, comes from the Lord. I was reading in Exodus this past week on how the children of Israel, um, they grumbled against God. And he said, instead of rebuking them and saying, wow, you are so uh, disobedient and all of these things. And this was 45 days after God had parted, or after they had left Egypt. And they'd seen God do all the plagues in Egypt. They'd seen God kill the firstborn of all the Egyptians. They'd seen him stop the Egyptians by a wall of fire so they couldn't get to him. Um, they saw God part the Red Sea. They'd seen all these things, and they began to grumble against him and forget that everything came from his hand. But God, in his love and care for the Israelite people, gave them manna. And every day gave them manna for 40 years while they went until they came across into the promised land. And so um, I think maybe in other countries where there is a lot of poverty, it's easier to see, or maybe not easier to see, but easier to understand that what they have is a gift of God. And so, like, we're just so prosperous here that we often forget that we are not dependent on Him for everything, even the next breath. So that's what that prayer about. Give us this day our daily bread. Um, it's an acknowledgement that He is our provider, and we are ultimately dependent on Him for everything. Question number 6: How is the prayer "Forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors" an evidence of a surrendered heart? Well, it's an act of a surrendered heart because it's an acknowledgement that we had no right, or we hadn't done anything to earn our forgiveness, and we're unworthy to come before a holy God because we are tarnished by sin. Is what the answer there is in the lesson. But it's an acknowledgement of who we are and what God did for us. And how can we reject forgiveness for others whenever God has forgiven us so much? And so it's a surrendered heart because we are surrendering our pride and thinking that we are more than we are. It's a surrender of feelings of bitterness and the emotions of anger that we would have towards someone else. Maybe even those are legitimate emotions. But there comes a time when you have to give them up, because if you don't, bitterness forms in your heart, which leads to a whole other multitude of sins. And so realizing that we were also unworthy of being forgiven will help us to offer forgiveness to others. The next thing is, have someone read James 1:13 and 14. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and He Himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. So, that being said, this next question And I don't know that I've ever heard anybody question this, but I think it's something that we need to go over, because if we don't, then if students ever do come up with this question, they'll be like, what's going on here? So we're asking God not to lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So why did Jesus tell us to say that if God does not tempt anyone? Um, Basically, I'm just going to read the answer to you here. This is a prayer that God will protect us from all evil, the evil of our own hearts and from the evil one. It is a prayer that God not allow Satan to tempt us with any temptation that is too great for us to resist, a temptation that would break our faith. It is a recognition that we are weak and in need of God. It is submission to His ways and a desire to walk in them and plead that God would help us to do so. So it's not an acknowledgement that God tempts us at all. It's an acknowledgement that God is sovereign, that He leads and guides and directs our path, and that we don't want to go down the path of sin. We don't want to be tempted beyond what we can bear, because He is the one that allows the tempter. As we see in the book of Job, God allowed Satan to do things to Job, but there was a limit. At first he said you can go down and do all these things to him, but and then Satan came back and said, well, yeah, I took all this stuff away from him, but I didn't touch himself. I didn't touch Job. So God had set a limit. You can do these things, but you don't touch Job. Then he went back and said, okay, you can do more things to Job, but you cannot take his life. And so God is the one that puts parameters around what Satan is allowed to do in tempting us. So even in that, we want to make sure that we acknowledge God, His power, and we are dependent on Him even in those situations to deliver us. So as we come to the end of the look portion, it's just important to remember that the Lord's Prayer is a God-centered prayer and not focused on us. We've got to surrender to God in all things, and understand that submission to Him allows us to see everything else differently. I have learned that as much as anyone going through this stuff. And I don't know how you feel as teachers, but I know I feel that in teaching this submission study, that God has made me so aware of all of the ways that I need to submit to Him on a daily basis. And I'm very thankful that we are going through this together, and that, I think the best way we're going to be able to teach them is by example. Like, we can go into the classroom every week and say, you need to submit in this area, you need to submit in this area, you need to submit in this area. But if we ourselves are not living out in front of them what it means to live a surrendered life before God Almighty and before the world, then there's no correlation to reality. We all know what we're supposed to do for the majority of things, but it's about carrying it out and doing what we're supposed to do. So I want to encourage you to examine yourself, just like I examine myself on a daily basis, and say, am I living this out? Will they be able to see it in me? Because the example of the surrendered life is powerful, and I encourage you to look at yourself and say, how am I doing? Now we're going to move into the took portion.